Morning, everyone. We will just take a minute or two to allow all the participants to continue joining. Maybe as a quick introduction, just before I start, I'd just like to begin today by acknowledging to everyone that I am joining the webinar from the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, which is the traditional territory of the Nanaimo First Nation here in Nanaimo. And I'd like to welcome everyone from around the country. I understand that we've got coast to coast and possibly the northern coast covered. It's about 500 people I think we had pre-registered, maybe a little bit more. So it's great to have so many people here wanting to learn and share and move forward on our path of reconciliation. Our presentation today was helped put together. I can't say enough thank yous to Eric and Eli, the folks at IISAAK OLAM, and the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership. When some of our colleagues here on the West Coast were trying to figure out how best to acknowledge today and set ourselves on a path forward through the TRC calls to action. Our friends out here were very, very helpful in helping us learn, and this went from a local initiative to something that we were able to share nationally through CRP. So thank you to everyone there. A little bit of an outline on how things will work today. We'll have 3 presentations. Eli will start us off with a bit of a history on treaties and potential path forward through the IPCAs, which you'll learn about. Eric will talk about some considerations in design for architecture, engineering, and construction. And then Kiera will speak to environmental preservation and reclamation. And after each presentation, we'll have a short Q&A through the chat window, and we'll wrap up the presentation, hopefully with about a half hour of some roundtable discussion and learning amongst all of us. So without further delay, I'd like to welcome Eli and Tina and Evan to start off today's presentation.
Evan, introduce yourself.
Uklasish Evan. Uklasish Evan. Uklasish Christina. My name is Christina.
Uklasish Eli Enns. My children here, Christina and Evan, have been learning our Nuu-chah-nulth language during the pandemic via Zoom lessons with the Language Keepers Society on the west coast of Vancouver Island, with teachers like our treasured elders, Moses Martin, Levi Martin, and other elders from our community. And so we're very happy that they're able to do an opening prayer for today's webinar. So the first prayer is about asking Creator to, help us on our learning journey, because we're all on a learning journey in this. Like there's no handbook, so to speak, on how to walk this path of reconciliation, and so we're all collectively on a learning journey here. And then also the second prayer that they'll do, the second part of the prayer will be to encourage all good things to come towards us and to become a beacon for positive energy. So I'll let you guys go from there.
Hathape Hatwe, Naja Atuin, Kwa Akin, Hotakshia, Tana Se Apina, Hawed Miss Hawed, Tana Se Apina, Hawed Miss Hawed, Tana Se Apina, Hawed Miss Hawed, Tana Se Apina, Hawed Miss Hawed.
Click-o. So Tina and Evan are from Nuchanoth on my late father's side of my family, but on their mother's side of their family, they're from Sioux Valley Dakota Nation in Manitoba. And they also have connections to Peguis, Ojibwe, where the two rivers come together in Winnipeg, Manitoba, on their grandfather's side of their family. And so I want to just share a short little prayer that I learned from their ancestors there in Manitoba. And so to get us started off here, Ikche Wichasha Tushina Wakan Wopida Wiya. Ikche Wichasha, pity me, creator, for I am just a simple human being. I'm born into this world naked and vulnerable, and I'm dependent on all of creation for my survival and to thrive. Tushina Wakan, creator, I wear the great mystery of the universe like a garment. I recognize and accept that there are some things in this world that I will never know. Wopida, we deep sense of gratitude for sun daughter, Mother Earth, for she's the gateway between the physical and spiritual world, and all life depends on her. And so I want to emphasize that the last part of that prayer, which is about the connection between the reconciliation that we're doing as human beings and the reconciliation that we're doing with Mother Earth. They are interconnected, and there's a beautiful quote from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which says that that reconciliation between Crown and Indigenous peoples can never happen until there's reconciliation with Mother Earth. And this has been a consistent message through the generations from the elders who have been welcoming people from afar to come to Canada and North America about the proper conduct. So I'll pause there and allow for I think, Terry, if I understand correctly, do you want me to just run headlong from the opening prayer into my presentation, or is there anything else you'd like to say before I do that?
Thank you, Eli, for the reminder. Yes, we're going to have a very short poll just to gauge everyone's sort of knowledge space at the start of this presentation, and then we will have a follow-up at the end. So if I could get all our now 500 plus attendees to try and overwhelm our poll questions. We'll do that for a minute, and then Eli will begin with his presentation. And again, thank you very much, Evan and Christina, for starting us off today. That was great. And I'll just allow our background moderator to observe the info coming in and give me the sign when we can move on.
Ready to go, Terry?
Yes. We are now well over 90%. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, Eli. I will turn over to you.
Right. So to kind of set the broader context here, one of the questions that we ask is, what does the word Canada mean? And the word Canada is a very beautiful word in my mind. It comes from the Haudenosaunee language, and it means village. And I often think about what a huge country this is. Canada is a vast, dynamic, geopolitic, and vast, dynamic, ecologically diverse country. And so what a quaint name for a country like this, Canada, from the Haudenosaunee language that means village. There was a history moment that was aired on public television years ago about an Indigenous fellow guiding a non-Indigenous fellow, and the guy, and they pointed down at a bunch of teepees, and they said, what is this? And the guy said, Kanata. He's saying this is a village. And then the European fellow, he says, oh, this country must be called Canada. And it's kind of a silly misnomer that when you look at the reality of the history, the Haudenosaunee Confederation played a very pivotal role in the history of North America and the world, really, when they allied with King George during the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War was the first, considered to be the first global war because it took place on multiple continents at the same time. And it was a sort of colonial war between the French and the British. Now, the Haudenosaunee Confederation had a strategic advantage in North America because of the pre-existence of a sophisticated network of peace and friendship treaties that had been cultivated over centuries through the Great Law of Peace. And this is not my history. This is a history that I've learned from elders and from the research that I've done as a Canadian political scientist. And so what I've learned from the elders and through my research is that the peace and friendship treaties themselves were very important international social innovations during times of war because of the collective security arrangements and securities that were provided. In other words, if one of the treaty allies within the Confederation was attacked or went to war, all members of that treaty alliance would be considered to be attacked and would send warriors to defend and fight alongside their sister brother nation. But equally, if not more important, these peace and friendship treaties had provisions, geopolitical provisions, economic provisions that were important during times of peace. They were not just utilized in times of war. More importantly, the peace and friendship treaties came into significant impact during times of peace in what I've come to know as bioregional economics and peaceful commerce, or the free flow of surplus goods through lines of relationships across ecological boundaries. Think about rivers and mountain ranges and valleys and lakes, the natural features of the landscape, which once, instead of lines on maps, these natural features created natural boundaries among various nations. And so this treaty, this alliance, this military and economic alliance between the Haudenosaunee Confederation and King George was a strategic advantage for him and allowed him to successfully defeat the French. And the French, of course, they had their treaty relationships with other Indigenous nations. So when they lost the 7 Years' War, they fled north and receded into those treaty relationships, eventually forming the province of Quebec. This is a foundational geopolitical event in the early formation of in Canada, as well as the Métis Nation. Of course, the French played a key role. And the beautiful thing about the Métis Nation, and again, I'm not Métis, and I believe Kier has some Métis ancestry himself. But what I've learned from people like Will Goodon and others from the Manitoba Métis Federation is that the coming together of cultures was more done, not one dominating the other, but coming together and co-creating a new language, co-creating a new culture that goes back hundreds of years into the Métis homelands in Manitoba. And so, this early event created a cascading effect through time and across North America that still affects our lives today. King George, after the defeat of the French, he issued his Royal Proclamation of 1763, which was adopted into treaty at Fort Niagara, at the Treaty of Fort Niagara in 1764. And at that gathering, my elder, Larry McDermott, tells me that this was one of the largest gatherings of nations in the history of North America. And there were elders who were present at that treaty who forewarned that if consumption patterns continued the way he observed them, the way the elders were observing those consumption patterns, if that continued, that we would find ourselves in a dire situation where the environmental health and well-being of Mother Earth would start to decline, and this would include a decline in the health and well-being of our great-grandchildren. And so you can think of these early peace and friendship treaties as multilateral environmental agreements as well, because there was always a cautioning from the elders to, as long as the grass grows, the river flows, and the sun shines. And they invoked concepts of love like Zagindawin in the early treaty making days. Zagindawin, as taught to me by Professor John Burrows from the Indigenous Law faculty at the University of Victoria, means love, but in a more profound way, Zagindawin speaks about abundance, where a river comes into a lake or into the ocean, in that estuary, where the moving body of water comes into the still body of water, is where we always find the most abundance. And so they were saying, let us have a relationship of abundance with one another. And so these were the founding principles of what would eventually become known as Canada. And certainly there has been a dark period of time, and all of our lives have been impacted by that. The Indian Act was created in 1876, and the sort of most oppressive and violent elements of the Indian Act were introduced in 1885. This made potlatches, sun dances, and other sacred ceremonial practices of Indigenous peoples of Canada illegal. It was also illegal between 1885 and 1951 for 3 or more Indigenous men to be in a public place. And through evolutions in international law, namely the introduction or the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 and the Geneva Convention on the Status of Political Refugees in 1951, that international actors from Canada, political philosophers, diplomats, and others who were participating in co-authoring these important international doctrines and laws, when they returned home, they realized that their own domestic law was not in line with the newly forming body of international law, which, of course, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was spurred on with the discovery of what had happened in places like Auschwitz during the Second World War. And so so the Indian Act was overhauled in 1951 to take out those most oppressive elements, but the practices by the Canadian justice system continued on. And I can attest to that personally as a young urban Indigenous man. Well, I was 12 years old the first time that I experienced this myself in Manitoba, and this was 1992. The year after the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry of 1991, by the way, which had a whole bunch of recommendations that have not been implemented, and we have to learn from our past here. But yeah, in 1992, I was walking down a sidewalk with some other young Native boys, and we were pulled over by Brandon City Police. And I experienced the cruelty and racism of the Canadian justice system at that time. And there's an interesting complex that arises from such an experience where the police are supposed to be the good guys, you know. And so anyways, we've all been impacted in different ways by those dark times. Now, as we start to shift, you know, with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and with this first National Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada Day, I believe that there are, you know, positive things that we can start to cultivate together, and I see a great opportunity for this positive development to happen through professions, engaging professions such as planning, architecture, and engineering, which led to my enthusiastic participation in today's gathering. Terry mentioned Indigenous protected and conserved areas. I'll just provide a little bit of context as to what that is. It's a brand new jurisdictional designation in Canada that is still being defined as we speak. Indigenous protected and conserved areas, similarly to how federal government creates national parks, provincial governments create provincial parks, municipal governments create municipal parks, while Indigenous governments, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit governments can now in Canada create IPCAs, Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas. But what's different from an IPCA and a federal or provincial park is that we understand He-Shuk-Ish-Tsawak. You know, He-Shuk-Ish-Tsawak in the Nuu-chah-nulth language means everything is one and everything is interconnected. And so when we think about Indigenous protected and conserved areas, we're not just thinking about putting a fence around nature and then having Indigenous rangers or Indigenous guardians, you know, patrolling that fenced off area. We understand that through an understanding of He-Shuk-Ish-Tsawak, that community health and well-being and ecosystem health and well-being are inextricably linked. So we're talking about elders, we're talking about youth, we're talking about women, men, we're talking about medicines that are used by and still understood today on how to keep our lives up. Not just something we take when we get sick, but something we do and what we consume on a daily basis to keep our lives up. The traditional practices and the modern day application, the modern day augmenting through the involvement of the best of modern day technology and science for sustainability. And so it's going to be up to each Indigenous nation of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit governments to define for themselves how they want to use this new jurisdictional tool. But for myself, I see that a community, including all of the infrastructure needs, potable water distribution infrastructure, liquid waste management, solid waste, food systems, energy systems, housing construction, roads and bridges, stormwater management infrastructure, you know, the whole 9 yards. We have to put a new lens on the way that we do this conventional infrastructure. And of course, including now newer technologies like geothermal, solar, and other available technologies on how to better design communities. You can think of it like an IPCA eco-village that integrates human infrastructure and natural infrastructure in a more balanced way. And so this is, this is the thinking that I have to credit my Uncle Moses Martin and other Levi Martin and others who have taught me over the years about IISAAK. And folks like, and from the non-Indigenous side, Don McKinnon and Emily Chu and Alan Dolby, who mentored me in different ways in my young career, in my early mid-20s, about community development, where we, on the west coast of Vancouver Island, expanded one of our Indian reserves within the Pacific Rim National Park Reserve. And this community expansion would eventually become known as the Tyastanis Equilibrium Community Project. It was that project that really educated me about the interconnection of community health and well-being and ecosystem health and well-being, and how we can design better infrastructure and design housing better to have a more appropriate, role and impact within an ecosystem. And I want to also acknowledge Ron Martin and the other participants in the Tlaloquiet Community Development Advisory Group that we formed back in 2006. And they spoke to me, and I'm thinking about Ernest David and others who spoke to me about that land. And they all said, the elders in particular emphasized that, yes, we can speak to you about this area of interest for expanding the Indian Reserve near Long Beach on the West Coast, but we can't speak to you about this piece of our territory without speaking to you about the rest of our homelands. And this eventually led to the revitalization of the Tribal Parks Initiative, which was one of the pioneering examples of what IPCAs would become. Of course, we also looked at other examples across Canada. We looked at examples in the United States, New Zealand, Australia, other parts of the world as well. But the Tribal Parks Initiative, for me, because I'm directly connected to it, is the one that most heavily influenced my own thinking on this. And so this is, we had micro hydroelectricity generation, geothermal. You can see, as professionals, you can see through this story where these various technical expertise could come into play with such an ecosystem level initiative that integrates community health and well-being. And so I'd like to start to conclude my comments here by saying that IPCAs first and foremost have to be led by Indigenous peoples, but by the very design and by the very nature of an IPCA, they are inclusive to non-Indigenous peoples, so-called, and other Canadians, let's say, who share our vision. And because the reality is 500 years ago, before European arrival on Vancouver Island or the West Coast, where I'm from on my father's side of my family, we never would have needed tribal parks. We never would have needed Indigenous protected and conserved areas. In fact, if you went into speak with the elders and the leaders 500 years ago and said, hey, I'd like to make that island over there a tribal park, they would have looked at you like you were crazy. Because IISAAK, and because our ancestors over 10,000 years in the known archaeological record, our ancestors had designed sophisticated economies that came from Mother Nature's laws. Sophisticated economies that did not degrade the land, and they were not just sustainable. The commonly accepted definition of sustainability is to meet the needs of today's generation without compromising or negatively impacting the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Well, my elders teach me that this is not good enough. We have a worldview of abundability, of abundance. And even my Uncle Joe tells me all the time, and for 10,000 years, our ancestors designed economies that were intentional about cultivating more abundance. And here we're talking about the classic understanding of the word economy as it's related to the words ecology and ecosystem that root back into one of the world's elder languages, the Greek language. And so I believe that what we need to do in this era of reconciliation, like I started out with saying earlier with my children in the TRC, that Crown Indigenous reconciliation can never happen until there's reconciliation with the land. And I say, I call out to you and I say, let's bring about a renaissance of peace and friendship. This country, remember, this country is founded on sophisticated social innovations, multinational social innovations, the Peace and Friendship Treaties, which, yes, they call for collective security. And our warriors have continued to go to war for this country. On the National Film Board of Canada, there's a documentary called Forgotten Warriors. And I would like all of you to watch that tonight. As many as you can, watch that documentary. It's not that long. And you can see that despite all of that, all of those hard times and the negativity of the Indian Act and the residential schools, that the Indigenous nations of this country have continued to go to war to protect this country. My great-grandfather, Nawas, sent one of his eldest sons to World War II. And we brought out regalia when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and the Canadian government wanted to fortify anti-landing craft embattlements and build an air base at Long Beach. Late Eddie Joseph, Harry Charlie, and Hyacinth David. There's a photograph of them in the treaty office back home, and we worked with the Department of National Defense to protect this country. And I don't like to glorify war, but the more important part of this is about peaceful commerce and bioregional economics. Bioregional economics is how we respect Mother Nature, how we operate with the sun-moon crest. It's really simple, but very profound at the same time, that our economies are governed by the sun and the moon. And if we can design human economies that work with Mother Nature's economies, then we will be resilient into the future, not just sustainable, but abundant. And so I just where I went down the rabbit hole there, I was saying that IPCAs is very much inclusive. We need to work together. We need to work with like-minded and like-hearted peoples from various sectors, from government agents. We're continuing to hold out the olive branch because ultimately, at the end of the day, we are in a time that was predicted by the old people, that we have to work together. And this is something that is continuously told to me by my elders like Moses Martin. And so I thank all of you for joining us today. I think I've probably outdone my word count for this morning, but I thank you all for joining us today, and I look forward to your questions and comments. So I'll end there, Terry, and you can pass the feather on to Eric, I guess it is.
Yes, thank you very much, Eli. Before we move to Eric's presentation, if there are any questions, we could send them through the chat, or we could loop around with a larger discussion.
Yeah. If just let it stew if you don't have anything popping off the top of your head, and we can circle back at the end there.
Maybe that's what we can do. Here on the moderating end, we'll record questions, so please put them into the chat. You can send them to the moderators or post them directly. So again, thank you very much, Eli. And Eric, if you're ready to go, pass the feather.
Okay, thank you. Let me just share my screen here. I'm not as adept at speaking without prompts. Eli, thank you very much for your words. That was excellent. Okay, can we see the screen there? Hosts? Yes?
Yep.
I will be speaking on engineering for wicked problems, how empathetic engineering can make us better allies in Indigenous-led conservation. So my name is Eric Wilson. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Victoria under the supervision of Dr. Faguni Mukhopadhyay in the Department of Civil Engineering and Dr. David Dunn in the Gustafson School of Business. My current working affiliations, I hold a position with IISAAK OLAM. I hold a position with RJC Engineers and UVic. RJC Engineers and the IISAAK OLAM Foundation are currently in the process of formalizing a partnership between the two organizations to support the newly formed IPCA Innovation Center that will work with Indigenous Nations in the development of IPCAs. And the first campus of the IPCA Innovation Center is being established in Quakelet Sound. I have been a laboratory instructor at the University of Victoria teaching first-year engineering design. I've been a assistant instructor teaching innovation and design to commerce students in the Gustafson School of Business. And through Gustafson, I've taught design thinking and innovation curriculum to STEM students in 5 different developing, 5 different countries in the developing world. My master's program was with RJC, looking at the impacts of the STEP code on cost and energy performance in residential construction. So intended outcomes of this, at the end of this 15-minute presentation, you'll be able to describe the difference between wicked and tame problems, demonstrate the importance of empathy in engineering design, recognize how empathetic design can help engineers to support IPCA development and reconciliation, and see some tangible examples that I'm involved with empathetic design. So I wanted to present some things that are called thinker tools. And hopefully the purpose of why I'm showing you these will be clear at the end of the presentation. But I'm hoping that they'll help me to illustrate the points I'm trying to make in a bit of an engaging and interesting way. So the first of which is one on the left. Can you correct that Roman numeral equation without touching the matches, adding any new matches, or taking any away? One in the middle. Can you connect those 9 circles with a single straight line? And let's say a single 12-point or thin straight line, and then one on the right. Who is that? And describe what they're famous for. So we'll come back to those. But first, we need to get on the same page about what we're meaning when we say design within the context of engineering. So from Engineers Canada, engineering design. Water break, sorry. Engineering design is a process of making a process that's informed, thoughtful, and creative. It's needs-based, it's open-ended, generative, iterative, multidisciplinary. We're designing a product, system, component, or process using natural science, mathematics, and engineering science to satisfy defined objectives within identified requirements and constraints. So Engineers Canada, this is their definition as the what of design. What are we designing, the tools we're using, and why we design. This would be a traditional engineering design project from the University of Victoria engineering curriculum. If you attended UVic, you might recognize this from Enger 120. This is definitely a creative process. This is where students are developing this autonomous vehicle to attach a cable there. You can see a little string to an infrared beacon. So this autonomous vehicle needs to be able to sense this beacon, navigate over to it and navigate unpredictable obstacles. So you might throw a hand in front of it and it has to navigate around your hand. To connect that cable to the beacon, navigate away without being entangled. So it's certainly creative, it's needs-based, it's definitely open-ended, it's multidisciplinary, and it exists within constraints. But this is what's referred to as a tame problem. A tame problem is a problem that's well-defined. It has a definite endpoint and a right or wrong outcome. You might think of solving something like an equation or playing a game of chess. If you're playing a game of chess against a grandmaster chess player, that's certainly a very, very difficult problem. It's not to say tame problems can't be extremely difficult, but tame problems are not the only problems that engineers are faced with today. They're faced with wicked problems. So what is a wicked problem? Well, wicked problems are a class of social systems problems. They're ill-formulated. The information contained in the problem framing is very confusing. There are many clients and decision makers with conflicting values, and the ramifications of the whole system are thoroughly confusing. This is Rittel and Weber in 1973. They also developed 10 elements that classify what a wicked problem is, including there's no definitive formulation of the problem. It can actually be framed in many different ways. There's no stopping rule, so you're not really sure when you've reached an end state. There's no right or wrong solution, only good and bad solutions. There's no opportunity to learn by trial and error because every shot counts significantly. Because actually the act of interacting with the problem may actually change how the problem operates. And if you're dealing with issues that impact people's lives, and you are trying by trial and error and it makes the problem worse, so you have no right to do that as a designer. This one is very important. Wicked problems are always the symptom of another larger problem. They go on to state nearly all public policy issues, whether it's the questions of the location of a freeway or the building of a bridge, perhaps not the design of a bridge, but the social implications around the bridge would be a wicked problem. Things like the modification of school curricula and that sort of thing. So in today's world, engineers are being integrated into multidisciplinary teams to be part of solving tough social issues like poverty, like climate change, environmental degradation, and water shortages. The problems that engineers in the 21st century are facing are inescapably social and technical. Also, these problems that I've just mentioned disproportionately impact Indigenous nations across Canada. Many of the challenges that Indigenous nations face are wicked problems. David E. Goldberg, he's the father of genetic algorithms and a very prominent university professor in the United States. He said, the world has changed. We now face substantial challenges that require technical capabilities of engineers to be augmented with a broader view of how engineers think, feel, and show up in the world. So there is good news. There is a type of design that is developed to solve wicked problems. The impacts of wicked problems can be mitigated through a process of design that's an intellectual approach that emphasizes empathy, inductive reasoning, and rapid prototyping. This is what's known as design thinking and systems thinking. So design thinking is empathizing with how stakeholders are seeing the world, and systems thinking is trying to understand the connections between all the components of the system, all the people in the system, and identify barriers to solutions, and see potential leverage points. Systems thinking is also sometimes referred to as co-design, and it's decentering the voice of the designer in the process and recentering the voice of the stakeholder. So let's return to these thinker tools here. So this one, the purple person says, this can't be done. The blue person says, I don't see a problem here. How's that? Well, empathetic design helps us understand diverse perspectives and takes account of the subjective reality of others. It's described as stepping into and out of the other person's shoes, taking a walk, walking a mile in someone else's shoes. We step into their shoes. Once we understand how this person that we're designing with is seeing the world, then we can then step back out and make some objective statements about how this person is viewing the world. and look at solutions from a perspective that we wouldn't ordinarily see. So see the problem from other perspectives. Let's jump to the third example for a second. So the blue person says, this is the father of general relativity. And the purple person says, scratching their head, that's a famous actress. How is that? Well, the world looks different to people from different walks of life. Both these ways of interpreting the world, this picture, are completely valid, and they're equally valid. Empathetic design is about designing with others for the way that they're experiencing the world. And this one, can you connect these with a single straight 9-point line, 12-point line? Well, yes, you can. But it's going to require you to identify some of the biases in the ways you're thinking and challenge your self-imposed constraints that keep you stuck in a particular way of thinking. These three things are very important when working with Indigenous nations, because we need to be able to identify the constraints that we place on ourselves and ask if those constraints are valid, because if we can get past those, we might be able to come up with some innovative solutions. So AEC professionals and IPCAs. How do we bring together these two ways, equally valid ways of seeing the world? Traditional Indigenous knowledge with the best of Western science, and start thinking holistically about the interconnection between infrastructure, ecosystem, and community. IPCAs offer this opportunity. IPCAs see this connection between multiple different areas. As Eli was saying, IISAAK, everything is one, everything is connected. This is all done through the lens of what's called ethical space. This is coming together of two worldviews, two equally valid ways of seeing the world, and bringing them together as envisaged by Elder Dr. Albert Marshall as two-eyed seeing, to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing, and from the other with the strengths of mainstream knowledges and ways of knowing, and to use both these eyes together for the benefits of all. So empathetic design and empathetic engineering gives us a method and a mindset to accomplish infrastructure development within this ethical space framework that's at the heart of IPCAs. I want to share with you some tangible examples of empathetic design in practice. So one is the IISAAK Housing Solutions Lab. So IISAAK OLAM created a partnership with the IISAAK Nation on Vancouver Island to look at housing issues facing their nation and create an application to CMHC's Solutions Lab initiative with the National Housing Strategy of Canada. We established a learning community of 5 other nations who also identified housing as a critical priority in improving their community social, cultural, and environmental sustainability. We were partnering with the nation and engaging the community, engaging the nation, and we had to do some background research for ourselves and try to understand some of the situation. And housing programs that have been implemented since the 1940s by the government have damaged and severed relationships with traditional territory, with culture, with community, and government-imposed housing systems have perpetuated the fragmentation of culture, loss of connection to traditional lands and waters, and ultimately this loss of connection to this broader vision of home. And that's how we ended up framing our approach. Is this concept of home. The concept of home is not limited to the structure of a house, but encompasses the broader environment, the sources of food and water that nurture families, the cultural practices, traditions, and languages that develop our sense of who we are, the spaces in which we raise our children, and the sacred places where our ancestors laid to rest. So this framing was developed in partnership and collaboration with First Nation perspectives. In our last engagement session, which was our Ideas to Action session, we started to identify leverage points within the system to support housing development. And some of those leverage points were infrastructure servicing, cross-governmental collaboration, historical education for the broader community, and the maintenance and regeneration of traditional food systems. So systems issues require systems solutions. We can't look at our infrastructure as disconnected from our ecosystems. Everything is one, everything is connected. Another project I'm working on with Kier, who's the next speaker, is the redevelopment of Civ 412, Indigenous Infrastructure Engineering in Indigenous Communities. And what we're doing is we're redeveloping this course with a focus on direct engagement with partner nations, which is something that Kier has been doing with this course for several years. And we're integrating design thinking and systems thinking and empathy formation through Kairos blanket exercise, cultural acumen training, and ceremonies, reflection, self-reflection, and writing, and bias identification with the students, and in trying to improve intrinsic motivation, and doing this all through an ethical space framework. And this is where it links to my PhD research. So this is my PhD research, and what we're going to do is measure the change in emotional intelligence. And our friends at the Emotional Intelligence Training Company have offered to provide these assessments and coaching to these students to help set goals, self-improvement goals, and we're going to be monitoring their progress in their mindsets through self-reflective writing and pre and post surveys. So in summary, reminder of what I was trying to accomplish in this presentation is we were trying to describe the difference between wicked and tame problems in simple terms, demonstrate the importance of empathy in engineering, recognize how empathetic design can help engineers to support IPCA development and reconciliation, and then show some tangible examples of empathetic engineering design. And that is the end of my presentation. So thank you very much.
Good job, Eric.
Thank you, sir. Back to you, Terry.
Thank you, Eric. Just looking at the questions that have come in. Maybe what we could do, and thank you everyone who has submitted questions. We see them in the queue. Perhaps, Eric, unless you feel different, do you want to move on to Kier's presentation? And then we could start the discussion with the questions afterwards.
That sounds great.
Right. So yes, thank you everyone. We do see the questions coming in and we're putting them into the queue. So please keep them coming. And then without further delay, our friend Kier is going to speak to us about some environmental restoration. Kier, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Terry. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, my name is Kier Portress. Some of you may know me, some may not. I'm Métis on my father's side and Chinese on my mother's. And I've been lucky enough to know that I've been Métis my whole life. My dad was heavily involved with our community growing up. And my mother was also heavily involved in the Chinese community as well. So I have this really interesting cross-cultural mix that has allowed me to bring my personal life into my professional life. And so as you know, as a professional, I wear a few hats. I'm the Director of Indigenous Relations for QM Environmental. We're environmental services contractor that has a national presence and works with many nations on many different types of contaminated sites, emergency response, hazardous material and demolition projects. I also run my own consulting firm on the side, providing support for companies and communities. All types of project or Indigenous initiative support. And I'm also a teacher at UVic, as Eric, my colleague there, has said that I teach this fourth-year engineering course that really teaches, I guess, that design and brings in what what are the challenges of working with Indigenous communities, but also Eric and I are redeveloping that to include that, the wicked problems and design thinking attitude, because as I've seen the question here by CK in the chat, explaining that he's seen, many designs done by some engineers who may not care so much about the project, or maybe about the community that they're working in. And I see that all the time as a contractor, as a consultant. And, I think the big thing here is with contaminated sites, many communities and many people actually have no idea that they're working or living on a contaminated site. And many contaminated sites actually are being given back, and contaminated land, let's say, is being given back through treaty to communities, whether it's federal land or provincial land. And often the owners of that land want to get rid of it because it's a blight for them financially, legally, and giving it back is a good thing, but creates other challenges around having that contaminant continue to affect not only the environment but also the community and what they can do with that land. For instance, actually near Eli's home territories, the Toquat Nation took over a beach. I'm not sure if anyone has been out to, I think it's called Secret Beach. There used to be a campground out there. And they took that land over again through treaty, and soon after that found out that the beach was covered in mine tailings and found to be not suitable for a campground, and so they had to shut it down. And we're working all over Canada, and I see this stuff happen a lot where communities are impacted by contamination, and I think getting it assessed and having, many of the people here are engineers, and I'm sure many are environmental engineers or involved in building projects where there has been contamination. And, assessing those sites and creating design for those sites is only one part of that. Cleaning it up and how those sites are used into the future are, the bigger part, actually. And I think as contractors, as engineers, as architects, including the communities in the design level to understand and understand the sort of broader picture and bringing people into that level, because they're going to be heavily involved in those sites, going forward into the future is really important. I think when you start cleaning up the site, or when you start creating, bringing those designs to construction, there are a lot of procurement opportunities, a lot of training opportunities that many nations can take advantage of. If you set them up in a way that makes sense for them. If you build out the RFPs, or if you build those opportunities to be able to bring in, maybe low-skilled people or Indigenous or community-based businesses, to allow people to be involved in those projects, because these are the people who live in those areas. They actually have the best knowledge in those areas. When I was working on the Sayouts, the Sayout First Nation is building a big house right now, and we were sitting down with their public works guy, and he was like, you know what, this whole part of the site is fill. So if we put, the stormwater infrastructure in over here, it's not really going to do anything. So we should do it on this other side where there's native fill, and it's going to be more effective in getting the water off site and into that infiltration system, rather than, just straight into a ditch or straight into our areas. So, don't don't take being an engineer too seriously. You know, I think just bringing more people to the table is really important. And in the sense of contaminated sites, you know, I think if we're giving back land and more communities, you know, are very interested in taking back their land and, you know, the land back movement, if you will, you know, if a lot of those lands are contaminated, or if that's, you know, part of the strategy is to, you know, give back really unwanted lands to a lot of these Indigenous communities, that it plays directly into these IPCAs, you know, take back the land, you know, take back those areas and then create a protected area that is governed and overseen by the First Nation. You know, I think we've just reached, you know, it's the tip of the iceberg for a lot of this type of work, where bringing in communities and bringing in different opportunities to have co-management or, you know, just straight management of lands with Indigenous communities and peoples is really important. And, you know, in my 9 to 5 with QM Environmental, I'm seeing that all the time, right? And creating those opportunities to have not only companies and communities involved, but the people of those areas, I think is really important. And sometimes the capacity isn't there. And, you know, I think as professionals, we have a responsibility to, you know, pass on our knowledge and support Indigenous people and Indigenous inclusion in our fields of work. And, you know, I think sitting down and creating training plans, or, you know, starting at that design stage to make things really successful for communities to take over that land or to take over the building, and creating designs that work, and not just, you know, choosing the design that has the most financial upside for you as a professional or as a company. And often that's simpler designs. You know, it's in you know, in the environmental industry, you know, I think it should be, you know, fully cleaning up and committing to clean up sites, and giving it back in the way that it's meant to be in nature. And so I think those are the things that, if you have more people at the table and you have more of those discussions, that you create more of a connection with the clients and with, you know, the partners of those projects, and you almost force people to care. You know, you don't give them an opportunity just to put their head down and do the work. I think, you know, when you start talking about training opportunities, when you start talking about the future and the impact of, you know, the work that you're doing, that almost a byproduct of all those people and taking a little bit more time to do the design and, you know, take in all those parameters, will force people to care. And if they don't care, they won't be on the project that long. You know, there's very few Indigenous communities that I know, where if they see somebody who isn't genuine, or they feel like they're not taken care of, that they'll say, you know, I think they'll say it to somebody. And, you know, if you hear that as a professional, I think you have a responsibility to bring it up to the project manager or to the person who, you know, maybe isn't taking those considerations and isn't taking care of the project in a way that, you know, reflects the needs of those people that they're serving. So, you know, I think, again, the hand in hand of clean up contaminated sites in, you know, which aligns with the IPCAs, but also the work as engineers in thinking about the longer game stuff, and not just the design and not just the stages that you're brought into, but, you know, the larger picture. Asking the questions and involving people is probably, you know, what I would really like to hit home here for many people on this call, and many community members who are part of this, is, you know, ask to be part of it. You know, demand to be part of it. You know, I think those are a big part of these projects. Happy to, you know, talk about it more and look at, I'm really looking forward to the roundtable that's coming up. Back to you, Terry.
Right. Thank you, Kier. Caught me. Look, we're almost right on time. That's fabulous. So we have been receiving questions, and just a quick reminder before people do log off, nearer to the end, we are going to run the post presentation poll just to see how people feel, where they've picked up information during the course of today's event. You'll also be receiving a follow-up email through the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership and Eventbrite with some information recapping the presentation. So we'll be able to put in some stuff in there, the easy questions. We have links to the Forgotten Warriors, which is in the chat as well. Thank you for posting that. We'll have some redirects or links to IPCA info. And with, I'll just move on to some of the questions that have come in, and if the rest of the panelists can feel free to jump in. There was a question more to Eli, just about learning more about how everything is created as the guiding principle in the Nuu-chah-nulth culture. How is it written, and is it able to be looked into further, or resources?
Oh, like the IISAAK
I believe so.
connected, right? Yeah. Yeah, IISAAK. I mean, obviously, IISAAK. That's probably how it would show up in the Google if you Googled the IISAAK. And the ISAAK is the highest law of the Nuu-chah-nulth Constitution, which is represented by the sun moon crest. And loosely translated, ISAAK means respect, but a more nuanced understanding is to observe, appreciate, and act accordingly. And so this is about observing what's happening in nature, and to have a clear observations to allow for your inner world to become populated with the with a more accurate reflection of what's happening in the world around you, so that your thoughts, your words, and your actions will flow from that understanding. And this is how our ancestors designed these economies, and you can think about it in terms of like biomimicry. My great late grandmother, Mary Hayes, taught me about the teachings of the salmon fishery. And as you probably all know, at the time of early contact, there was just a tremendous amount of salmon resources, wild salmon resources that were available on the West Coast, as well as other types of fish and ocean and salt and freshwater aquatic resources. and within a very short period of time, that abundance was degraded very quickly. But anyways, Mary Hayes said that there's 3 simple rules that came through observing nature on how our ancestors cultivated that abundance. The salmon populations were not just kind of accidentally there. There was rules, simple but powerful rules. Mary Hayes always said that the teachings of our ancestors are simple yet powerful. And with these rules, our ancestors governed the salmon fishery for thousands of years. There was a Harvard economist named Trosper, Dr. Ronald Trosper. He published a book in 2009 called resilience, reciprocity, and ecological economics. Trosper was this book, this little blue book, was an inverse of the series called Collapse. Collapse looked at ancient civilizations and that had failed, ancient civilizations that had destroyed themselves or had been destroyed, and tried to figure out what were the common denominators of the failure of these ancient civilizations. And what Trosper did is he looked at the pre-contact societies of the Pacific Northwest, and he was trying to answer the question, how did these societies not only survive, but thrive for over 10,000 years in the known archaeological record? And through a Harvard economic analysis, there was some things that he figured out, that he observed. And this was, reinforcing the teachings that I had been given by people like Moses and Joe and Mary Hayes and others from my community. And those teachings are still there. And then, so like Eric was saying, we have the opportunity through innovations like ethical space to bring those ancient teachings to bear, those indigenous knowledge systems to bear, together with the best of Western science and modern day technology. And so I think that's the real opportunity that we have in front of us. And one thing I didn't mention is that we're embarking, while the IPCA movement didn't just come out of thin air, there's many roots of it. One of them is through the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. The UN Convention on Biological Diversity is sort of the poor cousin of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And similarly with the Climate Change Convention, the CBD, the signatory countries to the UN CBD get together every 10 years and make goals. And the goals, the 20 Aichi targets that just sunsetted on December 31st, 2020, include the increase of parks and protected areas to 17% of the terrestrial and inland waterways of all signatory countries, and Canada being one of those signatory countries. And now that goal has increased since 2020 to 25% by 2025 and 30% by 2030. And so when the Canadian government asked, how can we achieve these goals and commitments to the international community in partnership with Indigenous peoples, we formed a committee, and that eventually produced a document called the We Rise Together report of the Indigenous Circle of Experts. Indigenous Circle of Experts for the Pathway to Canada Target 1 can be found on our website, but you could also find on the website here, www.canada2020, Conservation 2020, sorry, Conservation 2020 Canada.ca. And you can find the other reports. But the ICE committee, the Indigenous Circle of Experts, was 20 people. Half of them were subject matter knowledge, Indigenous peoples experts. And on the other half were government representatives from the province of Nova Scotia, Ontario, Manitoba, British Columbia, the government of the Northwest Territories, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, the Canadian Wildlife Service, Parks Canada, Indigenous Affairs, just a full, so it was 20, it was a 50-50 government employees and Indigenous experts. So that's what defined the term IPCAs. And so the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership builds upon that. Recently, the Canadian government invested $340 million in the creation of IPCAs and Guardian programs. And the private sector, as well as the philanthropic community, is following that leadership. And there's been a lot of positive developments since. So this is just a little bit, there, Peter Labor. Okay, lovely. So yeah, so that's a little bit more context for this. And now, like we were saying, IPCAs are not just about studying the biological diversity or such. We understand that our ancestors had designed economies that would naturally cultivate more biological diversity, and now we need to work with, planners, engineers, others with practical skill sets that we can collaborate with to realize this expanse. We're at 12.8% currently of the country, and we need to get 25% by 2025. That's basically 4 years to pretty much double parks and protected areas. 2030, 9 years to get to almost tripling the parks and protected areas. And so it's a kind of an all hands on deck moment. It's an opportunity to improve the overall biological diversity in Canada, but also to make significant progress on reconciliation. I'll end my comments there, Terry.
That's awesome. Thanks, Eli, and everybody that's also populating the chat. We're going to have a lot of follow-up information, and I think we're all avid readers that are attending today, so we've got some good follow-up reading as well. Maybe what I'll do is I'll jump into the first. There's a lot of questions, but here's a good sort of tough, honest question. If I paraphrase a little bit, but maybe as a panelist, we can speak to this quickly. Some resistance to making empathetic engineering decisions can come from senior staff, whether it be engineering firm leadership, architectural firms, municipals, if they're either unaware or don't make that a priority. And then there's always budget constraints around that. So considering in our profession where young engineers, architects can't work independently, or they shouldn't. They should have mentorship. How can you go along with non-empathetic decisions? And is there a solution to that? And what can we do to make a more inclusive environment where people can voice their opinion? Maybe I'll take the first crack at that for the panel. It's hard for me to recognize, but I am a bit of an older guy, and I am in a bit of a position of authority. It's really important from a leadership position that we do listen to new staff and younger staff. And I think the industry is getting better. I've learned more from my kids when they were in elementary and middle school than I ever did when I was in the public system many decades ago. And then having the opportunity to work with people like Eric and Keir and their better knowledge and understanding led me to meeting Eli and others. And, so an older fella like myself can learn and appreciate and become what Eli has described as a good ally. And I think most people in leadership do want to be. So don't be afraid to speak out and speak up in your community and with your employer, because leadership does want to listen, and we do want to improve, and we do want to take these paths, these steps towards along reconciliation. We want to be good allies. I don't know how others on the panel might want to respond to that.
Yeah, I'll take a crack at a response there. So as Rittel and Weber in their dilemmas in a general theory of planning 1973, they had said that curricula development is a wicked problem. And it's also, this issue is very much tied to curricula development. there are so many different stakeholders involved in this area. And I don't think change is going to come quickly, but change is coming. There's a book called The Whole New Engineer. Take a read through that, The Coming Revolution in Engineering Education. It's coming. It's about David E. Goldberg's talking about Franklin Olin College and the University of Illinois, who both developed engineering programs that had this specifically in mind. And there are other engineering programs across Canada that do this, like the University of New Brunswick is one of them. Very good engineering design program there that has entrepreneurship at its heart. But because this is a wicked problem, there's so many stakeholders, it's really sort of a multifaceted grassroots movement that needs to happen in order to instill this into the engineering profession. The engineering profession won't start taking it seriously until the accreditation boards, or engineering education won't start taking it seriously until accreditation boards see it as important. And accreditation won't see it as important until it started to show in industry how it's important, right? So there are many places that this issue needs to be addressed kind of simultaneously, engineering education being one, industry being another. Take a read through that Whole New Engineer book, but there's also his, that's called bigbeacon.org. That's David E. Goldberg's kind of mission to improve engineering education, improve the engineering profession. So yeah, it's a systems problem. It needs systems solutions, and industry and academia are two prongs of that.
Cool. Eric, just to let you know, your volume was kind of petering out there. I don't know if that was just me. But yeah, I'd like to kind of add to that, and Eric's sort of hits the nail on the head there, that there's a lot of moving parts that are happening here. Working for a contractor where I'm, often seeing industry really shift for Indigenous inclusion at the, at the contracting level. There are a lot of functional reasons for that. Within QM, we can hire somebody who's totally unskilled, has never had a job ever. Also coming from consulting, trying to recruit people for consulting firms. And I'm sure I see Terry nodding here, and I'm sure everyone else on this call will have similar stories. It's very hard to find engineers who are Indigenous. And it's very difficult to, I think, shift in the way that engineers do business, which is, often purely design focused or project focused. They have those blinders on, and when you're like, hey, do this touchy-feely thing, most of them will be like, well, that doesn't have anything to do with us. And I think just having that integration and the emphasis on those softer pieces and this knowledge, I think, is really important, so that young engineers are supported by older engineers who might not have the knowledge but are seeking the knowledge. And industry is going to change, right? We see almost, I don't want to say every, but a lot of government tenders that come out that have some sort of Indigenous inclusion in them at all levels, from contracting to consulting. So industry's being forced to change, and it's at this time, every RFP that comes out is totally different than the next. I can't explain, like, I could do 3 hours just on the differences that I've seen last week. And so, I think industry's changing and going into the academic institutions and forcing change from the top down is really what I'm seeing. And students, I don't think they'll know the difference. You just tell them this is what's required, and they can complain all they want, but honestly, like, if it's a requirement, nobody's going to bat an eye. So I think there is change happening at all the levels. It's happening very quickly, and I think in 5 years we're going to see things that are totally different in terms of soft requirements and education and stuff like that. So yeah, I think that's the biggest piece there. And you know, from this question on the empathetic voice, to have those concerns, I think creating very plain policy and communicating policy around, you know, inclusion and that you know, Indigenous and cultural sensitivities within the company will allow younger engineers to have that voice, to say, hey, actually it's part of our policy that, you know, I should be supported. So, you know, I'm going to say that, where I think maybe in times past or in places where you lack the policy, you know, even if it's informal, to say, yeah, you know, please make it known if you have concerns, or if you you know, feel like something should be brought up, I think is just part of that.
But more things to add on there as well. Terry, you looked like you were about to jump in there. Did you want to go first?
Yeah, maybe you can follow up too. And Kira kind of answered a couple of the questions as we work through, related around just, you know, awareness within communities. You know, how can stakeholders understand if, for lack of a better term, something isn't right? So that speaks to inclusion and having more Indigenous peoples in the industry. And that is changing, you know, changing not perhaps as quickly as we'd like, and there's initiatives afoot to help mentor and have more Indigenous input directly in industry. So that'll help prevent poor choices from making its way into design and into construction. It's probably a webinar for another day, because there are good movements afoot to help address that particular concern. Eric.
Follow up in terms of instilling empathetic competencies in the engineering profession. I've done a literature review, and I was looking into the conceptualizations of empathy in engineering. And you know, the style of engineering education that we have is really comes out of the 1960s. It comes from the space race and the times which everyone the purpose of engineers was shifting towards innovators and entrepreneurs towards a more scientific approach. And that approach is still very much focused in engineering education, in which you're valuing technical competencies much higher than social competencies. But there also, on the flip side, that's just engineering education that's doing that. You have this phenomenon in engineering practice, which comes out of the literature, when it seems like practicing engineers who have spent more time in industry begin to see the value of empathy and engineering and how they're linked. And it seems the more time that one spends in industry, the more prevalent and more important that link becomes in the minds of the engineer. And engineers, I think we get a bit of a bad rap sometimes as kind of unthinking design robots and that sort of thing. But there's also the argument that engineering is an inherently empathetic profession because of how we are designing for people, right? And I think there are some designs that's thrown out the window in terms of maximizing profits. But at the heart of engineering, I think, you know, we're designing infrastructure to make people's lives better. And I think that shouldn't be forgotten, right? Yeah.
This rolls into perhaps the next question. You might see it, Eric, in the context of some shelter projects that one of the attendees is working on. How can we encourage stakeholders to consider empathetic design? You know, in some cases, there's you know, trying to balance highly durable, you know, assemblies and housing, but still incorporate a sense of humanity.
Yeah, I think we get caught in a little bit of a catch-22, right? Because it's often not the stakeholders, it's often not the end users of the design that are paying for the project. Mm-hmm. And that makes it very difficult. And as engineers, then we need to be able to say, you know, who are we designing for, right? We're designing for the end user, and then inviting the various stakeholders into that conversation. You know, we might not we might not end up with the designs that we know are best for the end users. And I think that's part of the difficulty when we're designing projects that are being paid for by somebody else and not the end user. I think that's a big challenge. So I think just having open discussion, perhaps having a situation where you're actually having the people that you're designing for, say it's a social housing project, when you're getting the people who are paying for the project to directly relate and engage with the end users, with the people who will be in the social housing complex, I think it becomes more difficult at that point to say, well, your comfort is not as important to me, so I'm going to make this decision or budget. So getting people together, getting the users of the social housing project together with the people who are paying for the project, with the engineers. And that's the importance of bringing the end user into the design process. That's all I have to say on that. Except there's a funny quote that I heard, and it's designers and drug dealers are the only people that call the end users of their product users. Well, that was kind of a funny quote. Anyway.
Yeah. Hear your
I was
response.
saying that to say, I notice that I'm saying users a lot, and it comes with a bad connotation.
Yeah, because ultimately we're talking about homes and communities, and you have to have that, intimate connection. Otherwise, it's not just an object. Maybe I'll jump around a little bit here. There was a question: are there any groups that architects or anyone in our industry, I suppose, could join to remain engaged in this ongoing discussion around IPCAs and empathic engineering? I don't know, Eli, if you're aware of a larger awareness.
Yep. So one of the things from the ICE report, we had the four moose narrative. If anyone's familiar with the report, you'll know that the third moose is capacity development. This started off as like naming the elephants in the room. And then the elephants became moose, became a little more Canadian. And so the third moose is capacity development, recognizing that we're not just trying to achieve a spatial target to increase parks and protected areas to 17, 25, or 30%, that we actually want to, build meaningful capacity for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis governments to establish, govern, and manage their own IPCAs. So the University of Guelph, the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, and the IISAAK OLAM Foundation co-applied for funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada for a $2.5 million partnership project. So, and the University of Guelph put in some additional funding. So we have a 7-year partnership project that is focused not so much, there's not a strong emphasis on research, it's more on knowledge mobilization and capacity development. And it's called the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership, CRP. And the CRP has 7 streams of activities, including some research, knowledge mobilization, capacity development. And the 7th stream is called IPCA Economics, Infrastructure, and Financing. IPCA Economics, Infrastructure, and Financing. And I'm kind of the main driver behind that one, but we have co-leads, and Eric Wilson, who's on the call with us here, he's our co-lead on the infrastructure side. So the University of Guelph connects in with the University of Victoria. Eric, he saddles the civil engineering program at UVic and the Gustafson School of Business. And so he's helping to lead up on the infrastructure side. Now, the 7th stream will continue to operate through the CRP. in addition to, you know, infrastructure, we're looking at IPCA economics and financing the creation and long-term management and operations of IPCAs. But this is also going to become a major theme of Canada's first IPCA Innovation Center. So the CRP, like I mentioned earlier, it's a finite project, 7 years. Our funding and our mandate officially expires in 2025, but we have identified 3 legacy outcomes. Number 1 is to create a lasting association or network of IPCAs across Canada. Now, those are going to have to be led by First Nations, Métis, and Inuit governments. And those who wish to associate with this national network can do so. So that's one of our goals. Currently, the Indigenous Leadership Initiative is taking more ownership of that particular legacy outcome because it jives well with the work that they've been doing on creating a national Guardian network. ILI has been the big driver behind the Guardian program, the National Guardian Initiative, Val Courtois, Stephen Nita, and folks like that. The second legacy outcome is to create a solutions bundle for IPCAs. The solutions bundle brings together a Western science toolkit and an Indigenous knowledge systems medicine bundle, and bringing those things together in ethical space to co-create a solutions bundle for the establishment, governance, and management of IPCAs. So this is sort of walking the talk of ethical space. And the Western Science Toolkit is much more of a utilitarian approach, step 1, step 2, step 3. And on the medicine bundle side is more about our journey in life and the interconnection of all things. And so that is representing the Indigenous knowledge systems. And so bringing those things together in ethical space to co-create the solutions bundle is the second legacy outcome of the CRP. And the third legacy outcome is and by the way, just so everyone knows, that different cultures, as you know, like Canada is an incredibly diverse, culturally diverse country in terms of Indigenous people. So the idea of a medicine bundle is different for different peoples across the country. The third legacy outcome is to create a network of IPCA innovation centers. And these innovation centers were foreseen with the ICE process on a sub-regional distinctions-based approach. That might make sense to 3 people on the call, but essentially a sub-regional distinctions-based approach is to say that we can't just take a pan-Indigenous approach. A sub-regional distinctions-based approach is to say that Canada is a diverse geopolitic. The Section 35 of the Canada Act of 1982 identified 3 main Aboriginal groups: First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. That's the distinctions-based approach. And so there can't be one innovation center that is going to be able to service the needs of all of Canada, is basically the point here. And so the Pacific IPCA Innovation Center is in early stages of sort of coming out of the gates. We're partnered up with the Vancouver Island University, the Masters of Community Planning program there, civil engineering at UVic. We've got the David Suzuki Foundation, RJC. RJC has come on board as kind of our first private sector partner, the University for Peace in Costa Rica. We've got a variety of different partners, and we've got funding through the Canadian Mountain Network. anyways, won't go into all the details, but the Pacific IPCA Innovation Center will be coming. You'll see some announcements on it soon. And one of the areas of focus for this is going to be the 7th stream on IPCA economics, infrastructure, and financing. And the reason why I'm leaning on that so hard right out of the starting gate is because we have a great opportunity right now with funding from the federal government, but it's not going to be enough to really meet the demand. And I think, contrary to what some might say, I don't think we should rely wholly on government funding. I think that we need, just like our elders tell us that we need diversity in the environment, we need linguistic and cultural diversity. I believe that we also need economic diversity and diversity in our financing. And this is just a good, safe rule to follow in life in general, because if you put all your eggs in one basket, so to speak, and something goes wrong in that sector, like we saw this in some economies that were dependent on tourism during the pandemic, and those communities were just really highly impacted. But anyway, so the 7th stream is going to be one of the central features of the Pacific IPCA Innovation Center. And so I look forward to sharing more information with you about that in the future. But this will be, and Eric Wilson is kind of the main guy, the co-lead on the infrastructure side of all of that. So shoot. Go ahead, Eric.
Piece to add on that, and talking about diversifying the sources which funding are coming from. One thing that is really kind of it's a very unfortunate is that there are funds that are not able to be accessed by certain Indigenous nations, say for housing development from IISAAK, if there is an infrastructure in place. If the infrastructure isn't in place, you can't even access the funding for housing development. So it's kind of a bit of a catch-22 almost. Is like, how do you get, you can't get the funding for infrastructure development, you can't get the funding for housing without the infrastructure. So how does that make sense, right? But I think that's one of the reasons why diversifying revenue or the sources of financing is so important.
Yeah, again, thank you, Eli, for the expansion on forward-thinking organizations in the IPC. There's a number of questions there you kind of covered off. There was a note, and it's certainly worthwhile mentioning that some of our provincial organizations, whether here in British Columbia, EGBC, AIBC, and others, and I presume it's the same across the country, have enacted requirements for mandatory Indigenous awareness or Indigenous engagement training for keeping up with your continuing professional development, which is great. And again, that helps the capacity side of the equation. The more understanding that we have in industry, the better that we can be good allies going forward. I don't know if there's anything in terms of learning opportunities, Kier, or Eric, or Eli, that have jumped out to you that might be worthwhile for our participants today to search out. There's a lot of things that we've touched on in terms of background information through IPCAs, conservation through reconciliation. But are there other areas that young designers, engineers, architects, people in the contracting world should be thinking about?
Was that the answer that I just typed an answer to, maybe?
Oh,
Which is okay, it's fine.
it might be.
I don't mind talking about it because it's, yeah, there are a handful of groups out there that have different resources. I put in one which is growing in Canada called ACES in Canada. ACES is the American Indian Society, or Science and Engineering Society, or something along that acronym. It started in the States and it's been really well organized and supportive of Indigenous people in the sciences engineering space. You know, I would argue that architecture is in there too, but Indigenous professionals at that level, architecture and engineering are hard to come by because the wicked problem of education, you know, I don't, you know, it's orange shirt day, so, you know, like it's complicated. And so often, you know, I would say use ACES in Canada as a resource for students and industry really to, you know, get connections and resources that way. But as for like a comprehensive list or something like that, that's maybe a little harder to find. I know that I'm involved with a lot of different initiatives and there's a lot of overlap in that, but I think, you know, start there and then look at, you know, the different industries and the different things that are going on, and then, you know, build regional support systems through that, and through finding Indigenous professionals. You know, CCAB is a good way to do that. So the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, you know, is a good way to find Indigenous owned businesses and businesses that have signed on to different systems and policies to see what's going on, and building resources and building that list. Yeah, I don't know if there's one place that you know we could recommend people go to for that information or for that support system. And also think that creating space for Indigenous people to take on roles. I'm actually working with an organization right now that somebody in an operational role, so essentially a frontline role, initiated the indigenization of this company, or organization, I should say. It's I'm not going to use the name right now, but and he's conflicted because he's in an operational role, a heavy frontline operational role, and he's getting pulled into a leadership position, but because the size of the corporation, he's doing it off the side of his desk. But leadership, like upper leadership, like the CEO and people under her, are fully supportive of it. But then when he goes, you know, to talk to his boss, they're like, okay, well, that's good, but like, I'm going to lose you. You know, and I think when those initiatives and when somebody comes forward with a really good initiative, I think, and this is really difficult, you know, in engineering, especially right now, how busy people are, factor it into their job. You know, don't make them do it off the side of their desk. Because when you make people do it off the side of their desk, it takes 5 times as long, right? And I get profitability and I get utilization. You know, you can't run a company if it's just hemorrhaging money. But I think creating the space for good policy management and creating the space for that innovation to happen is really important. And again, it kind of goes back to what I said a little while ago on the empathy or you know, top-down policy type stuff, is to say, hey, you know what, if a really cool thing comes up and we think it's something that's really important for us, if we think this is an important thing for you as a professional, it's part of your 9 to 5. You know, I don't, you know, you shouldn't have to do 16 hours a day to try to, you know, get to that next stage in life. I think we're at a different level too. You know, I guess I'm considered a millennial, but I also have a young daughter, right? So I've got a 10-year-old daughter. Both my parents live with me, so multi-generational family. I know Eli, you know, you have a big family at home, and Eric and Terry as well have kids. So, you know, this idea that things are changing and values are changing, that, you know, I don't think we can do things the normal way anymore. And we need to have a very large perspective on what's happening. And to do that, involvement and a lot of different stuff needs to happen. And unfortunately, there's no silver bullet. It's more like a web. Yeah. Hopefully that answers the question. I know I typed something out and maybe it veered off a little, but
Well,
hopefully that's good.
Great, Kier, and it's in some ways I think it's a good part for us to start to wrap up. We couldn't get to all the questions, but we will try to get to that in the follow-up email that'll be circulated. If Tanya, our controller moderator, could put up the wrap-up survey for all who are still here, and there's still over 500 people on the line, so thank you very much for engaging with us. I see some of our attendees have populated the chat too with some continuing education opportunities, and so I encourage you to take a look at that. I'd like to take this time again to say thank you very much to Eli, Christina, and Evan for starting us off today, and Eli for all the background information, guidance, and context. It's something that so many of us haven't had the opportunity to engage with, and I think it's great. It'll help us continue on this path all across the country in different regions. I'd like to thank again our friends from AME and AES. I know a bunch of folks from their firms are on the call today, helping support this and get us moving forward. They've been good allies too. Perhaps a lead into a future webinar as it relates to capacity building. So our co-sponsors today, along with some of our architectural friends at Diamond Schmidt and Number 10, have also helped start up a scholarship fund and a mentorship program for Indigenous youth looking into AEC careers. So hopefully everyone can take a look at those opportunities across the country too, with your local post-secondary and education partners. The community would certainly just appreciate the support, and it's great to meet new people and engage them in our industry. I don't know if any other panelists have.
Yeah, just a couple of closing words, Terry. And I hope we can save all those questions, because I think it would be a really important foundation for Eric with the infrastructure side of the 7th stream. So that it won't just get lost in the ether. That those are important things to consider. And in concluding, I would like to just say a couple quick words about one of the early questions you asked, or that was asked, around leadership and what I've observed in my own life is this. The impacts of patriarchy are very comprehensive, and under the last provincial government, Darryl Plecas, the Speaker of the House for the provincial government, had created a forum on the role of members of the Legislative Assembly, and I was put forward as somebody who could help provide advice on the Indigenous side of that. And long story short, one of the things we identified is that members of the Legislative Assembly, as well as members of Parliament, are also subject to the similar types of influence by patriarchy and by as what happens with toxic sort of toxic masculinity in with the police force. It's been out in the open with the RCMP. This has been a big sort of story across the country. And I think that we all have an opportunity as our society evolves, and I think it's so appropriate to say this on Orange Shirt Day, when we're kind of bringing out some more colors into the way that we fashion ourselves, that we all collectively have an opportunity to feminize our workplaces and create more balance, in the work that we do. And I think that decolonization and addressing the negative impacts of patriarchy kind of go hand in hand. And so I want to end on that with, that there is a great opportunity here for all of us to, create a better society, and that the work of architects, planners, and engineers is absolutely key to that. And so I thank you again for your participation and your good questions. They won't be lost, and look forward to follow up in the future. Signing off.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate the time that you took today, and looking forward to continuing the dialogue in the future.